Hello, and welcome to Mindscapes, our series of conversations with men and women whose ideas, vision, and philosophy define our contemporary world. My guest today is a unique woman, a witch. Yes, I'm serious. She describes herself as a serious witch, a beloved witch, the title of her autobiography. I'm delighted to welcome Ipsita Roy Chakraverti.
Thank you.
Who or what is a witch?
A witch is actually a Wiccan. A Wiccan is the wise one, according to the old English word, Wicca. So this is what perhaps I am. I'm the wise one in today's world.
You know, traditional notions, and I know you're seeking to break them, would consider, the idea that someone should say, I am the wise one, to be extremely egotistical. To you?
Yes.
Feel that in some way?
Feel like
a sense of ego when you say, I am the wise one?
As I have said in my book also, that I think arrogance is a good thing. In a woman, it sets her at par with the goddess. I've never looked upon it as a bad thing to have. As a vice, it's a virtue, I feel. And when I say I'm the wise one, of course, I partly jest. But I was explaining the word Wicca, and Wicca does mean the craft of the wise. At one time, the wise women of the community, the wise women or the elders, let's say, the elderly women of the community were the Wiccans. And they were the counselors, they were the healers, they were the ones to whom people came to settle disputes. You could say they were just, what we would now call the panchayats.
In what way? So that we can try and get some terms of reference to the idea of Wicca. Where does it locate itself in what is sort of commonly described as the perennial philosophy?
Well, Wicca has a very special philosophy, which I think many people are not aware of. At least where I was taking my training in Wicca, we put a lot of stress on this. The philosophy of evolving the super breed, the philosophy of evolving the super breed of woman in our case. Because Wicca has always believed in that it is possible to evolve the super mind. And that is one of the reasons why we put a lot of stress on the teachings of Friedrich Nietzsche in our course. Of course, in the case of Nietzsche, it unfortunately got a bit politicized. But in our case, we felt that here was a subject, here was a branch of learning, a philosophy, through which we could find a process of mind evolution. And I think where this is concerned, a great Indian mystic, Sri Aurobindo, he's been of one mind, the evolution of the super mind, which can, at some time, perhaps connect with the supra mind. We believe in the super mind.
But in a sense that both Nietzsche and Aurobindo came much
later,
after the Wicca.
This I feel Wicca was the first in that way. It actually, if you go by years, Wicca historians say that it goes back 25,000 years. It is the oldest universal animistic paganism known to man. And at the time that man first became aware of the elements, of his surroundings, of his environment, at the time when man first started worshipping the mother goddess in all countries, all climes, we find the beginning of Wicca. In France, in Turkey, in Japan, in China, of course in India, in other parts of Europe, Greece.
What sort of techniques and practices does being a Wicca involve?
Well, I would call it more than a series of practices. It's not something it's not a cloak which you put on and take off. It's a way of life. As I said, it's a learning, it's a philosophy, it's a way of life. You are a Wiccan. I think anybody in his life without realizing it can be like a Wiccan. As I often say, every strong woman is a witch. It involves strength, it involves detachment, it involves the willingness and the capacity for study. It's a cerebral thing. Mainly it's a cerebral thing.
But beyond the process of being aware of the teachings,
Yes.
are there rituals?
In the beginning, when you are training, yes. Rituals not so much for the sake of rituals, but rituals so that the mind can become focused, the mind can become disciplined, the body can become disciplined, and that the person can finally align himself to the elemental powers. Because that again is an important part of Wicca. Not only development of the mind and of the self, but the capacity or the ability to align yourself with the forces beyond.
You mentioned Nietzsche and you mentioned Aurobindo
Yes.
and the supramind
Yes,
and what have
yes,
you.
yes.
But in those traditions, in some ways, it is seen as a refinement of the mind beyond the elemental. How does the sort of the supramind,
Yes.
the refining the mind to its highest potential,
Exactly.
to its most sort of sensitive sensibilities, if I can put it that way, how does that relate to the sort of the more elemental aspect that you
Yes.
talk about?
Well, I don't think there is really an actual contradiction there. There might be an apparent contradiction in this, that through the, let's say, through the earth, you rise to the ether. In the same way, perhaps through the very worldly, you can rise to the very spiritual, which I think is also part of many very deep Eastern religions and philosophies, this theory. So also, not only in aligning with the elemental, but sometimes, with the seemingly very basic or the very mundane. We have chants, we have spells, as they say, dealing with the very mundane needs of man and woman, dealing with very material things. So people have often asked me that if this is so, where is the spiritual which you talk about? So this is my answer, that only when we have understood the material, the earthly, and we have acquired it, received it, dealt with it, can we then rise to that which is beyond. And I think that is not really a contradiction, that is a necessity. And hence, in Wicca, you find the very mundane, as I said, chance for acquiring that.
You also
And then you
mentioned,
go
you also
beyond.
used the phrase super breed.
Yes.
And this was
yes.
something that the Nazis were trying to do. It makes people very nervous.
The super breed. Well, let's say, without becoming a Nazi, I think one can become a part of the super breed in a very positive way. And I think that's what we need in this 21st century.
So what would this super breed be?
The super breed, to my mind, is a cerebral being, a person who is in control, not only of himself, but who can perhaps control to a large extent his environment, his circumstances. Because we must remember that there is another meaning to the word Wicca, that is W-I-K. If you go to the root, that is an old Teutonic root, which means to bend. And the Wiccan was one who could also bend circumstances, her environment.
But could the Wiccan bend himself or herself?
Yes, in coping with life, because it would involve being a warrioress. And in being a warrioress, you must know when to fight and when to stand still. You must master both the, let's say, the strength which comes with activity and the strength which comes with passivity.
Well, when I said himself, you didn't correct me. Are there sort of male...
There have been a few, but mostly it's been a woman's craft, a woman's discipline. There have been a few rather famous male Wiccans also, like Robin Hood, for example, who was more than just a myth. He existed very much so. And they say that, well, he had all the qualifications for being a Wiccan. The love for justice, the defiance of normal social norms, if I can put it like that. There were 13 in his group of merry men, one woman there, of course. And his complete detachment from worldly things, and yet he could deal with worldly things when required. So he was a very famous male Wiccan. Otherwise, it's a woman's thing.
Tell me, why the traditional distortion of the image
Yes,
of a witch?
yes,
I mean, in everyday vocabulary,
Right.
it still survives.
It's a
When
very
you call
negative
someone a
word,
witch, it's
of
sort
course.
of... what happened?
Well, as we find it, as I told you, in the beginning it was a very positive thing. It was a very positive word, not only in the West, but in the East also. In the East we had the Yogini cults, we had the Dakini Vidya, we had the Dayan Vidya, which were all very, very positive. But I think the real persecution started in Europe, from Europe.
What prompted the persecution? What was it threatening?
I think it was organized religion against paganism. And these women, particularly these women, who became a threat, who started wielding too much power over the populace, over the community. It was partly that. It was also, I think, partly the beginning of the gender war. The male threatened by the powerful woman. And thus started, these horrendous trials, persecutions, torture, killings. In fact, between, say, the 14th and the 17th centuries, in Europe itself, it is said that about 8 million women were executed. It seems terrible. It was terrible.
Do you have any peers in India who also follow and share your commitment, your passion, your beliefs?
There are many women. There are many women. I can't say that they are doing this work in the same way that I am, but they're doing it in their own way. They have accepted it as their way of life. They are working according to the philosophy of Wicca. And over the years, many, many women have come to me wanting to become Wiccans. And I've held workshops. I've talked to women. I've done counseling. And yes, at the moment I'd say there are many women in India.
So when you say doing this work,
Yes.
what is this work?
This work,
that it involves?
well, in my case, it has been mostly research. It has been documenting, writing about my experiences. It has been, you see, it's like this. It's been work in evolution, as Wicca believes, that you don't really stay in one work or keep yourself to one work indefinitely. You have to move on. After you have achieved success or achieved fulfillment in one strata, you move on. I've done teaching. Teaching, I don't mean Wicca teaching, normal teaching, with working with young minds. I have done therapy, Wicca therapy, which deals with many facets of the, like crystals, sounds, chants, the proximity of the Wiccan, which is also important, the words of the Wiccan, which are important, therapy in that way. I've done statecraft, advising statesmen, which is also part of Wiccan Wiccan work.
Well, isn't statecraft just a polite term for politics?
It is something like Wicca and witch. Wicca is a good word, witch is a bad word. So also statecraft is, I think, should be the word, but it has degenerated, you're quite right, it has degenerated into politics. Yes.
So what has been your role in statecraft? We'll stay with the idea of statecraft.
Statecraft? Well, in the way that I have worked with the grassroots workers. And over here I don't mean one party only. I have worked with people at the grassroots level, let's say, the youth, the women.
What kind of work have you done?
I would put it down to part of it social work, what we would call social work, part of it the empowerment of women.
So in what ways has this
in my
manifest?
Wicca way.
What is the Wicca way
The Wicca
to
way,
do this? So what's the specific project?
Well, yes, teaching women how to fend for themselves, how to break the yoke of male dominance, how to banish fear from their lives. It has involved counseling.
So when you go down there to
Yes.
the grassroots
Yes.
and you want to empower women,
Yes.
what do you do? Do you talk to them? Do you get them to do projects?
No,
What
that
do you
is,
do?
yes, that is the practical part, of course. Getting to talk to them, getting them to work, very basic work, perhaps teaching them also at some levels about, certain work or vocational work which they can do. But also I feel it is the proximity of the Wiccan, my proximity. Over here again, at the risk of sounding egoistical, I will say that my presence as a Wiccan has a tremendous influence on women who are cowed down, who are browbeaten, who are battered, who do not know what to do with their lives, who are without direction. Over here, I would say it is the X factor.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned the X factor several times in your book. What is the X factor?
The X factor is that factor which cannot be explained through the rational mind or through the scientific, so-called scientific mind, or through, let's say, rational terminology.
So in what ways does it express itself, manifest itself, even if we can't explain its operation?
Yes.
What have been the moments in your life where the X factor has operated?
Well, I think partly it has been circumstances. For example, the way I entered Wicca, the circumstances which got together, which brought me to Wicca.
Tell us, how did you enter Wicca?
Well, I was in Montreal at that time. My father, he was in the diplomatic service. He was India's representative to India, in the ICCO, India's representative there, posted in Montreal. And I was doing my high school years there. Now, there was this family friend of ours, a very erudite lady, a writer, by the name of Corinne Lamont. Her husband was a professor of physics at McGill University. And in the course of some social interaction, she asked me one day that, Ipsita, you seem very interested in reading these fat books on mysticism, which I was, even if I didn't understand it all, I was fond of reading. And she said, tell me about something about Indian mythology. Now, sometimes when she talked like that, I found myself out of my depth, but I didn't like showing it. There was a certain smart aleckness in me also. So I said, yes, what would you like to know? So she said that, well, in the 5th book of the Rig Veda, there is talk of the sun god and his 7 horses and about his regality. But don't you feel that over there it is more the divine energy which is being focused upon and not so much the human character of the sun god? What do you feel about it? Now, here was something I didn't feel much about because I really didn't know much about the 5th book of the Rig Veda, you know. So, well, I tried to cover it up the best I could, but I think she must have seen through me. And she said, I think it would do you a lot of good, and perhaps you could contribute some work in future to a certain organization I belong to. So why don't you come with me to the next meeting? And she seemed a bit amused, but also very interested, And I did accompany her to the next meeting, which was held at, my future teacher's house. And over there, I was fascinated. It was like, how should I put it, part monastic, part very worldly, very erudite, as if university dons sitting down to a meeting, in this lovely wood-paneled room, lovely ambience. And the guide, she was reading, as we called her, the guide, Mrs. Telario, she was reading from this book on, I think it was on Chinese Taoism. And I sat there and I found the atmosphere so engrossing, so, stimulating, that I went back to the next meeting and the meeting after that, and each time we discussed the esoteric traditions of the world or read from certain books, old books, and the library I gathered must be very vast.
So that was the beginning.
That was the beginning, and I feel that was circumstances. That was the beginning of my
You've
entry
used
into
the word,
Wicca.
the mystical, the metaphysical, the X factor several times.
No, there were experiences. This perhaps, all right, was on a more, let's say, it could be coincidence.
Tell us that, and you'll forgive me for using the word in its conventional jargon, but amongst the many people you bewitched was Elvis Presley. How did that happen?
It happened because one of my colleagues at the society, she wanted me to come along with her. She was an actress. She wanted me to come along with her and sort of help her through a certain weekend when she was going down south, And she said, she offered me this bait, you'll meet Elvis Presley.
Yeah, and he even wrote you a song.
Yes, so I was again, I acted smart. I said, oh, never mind, you go along. So she said, no, come along, I want you along, you'll be a big help. So just to be of help to her, I went and I met him. And, let's say the healer in him was attracted to the healer in me, because I believed that he had the healer in him. He talked about a few experiences of his when he was able to heal people. And one of his greatest regrets, I think, was that people just sold him as a sex symbol. Whereas he felt, or he wanted to feel, that he could heal with his music. And that was the draw, you know.
You know, this aspect of sexuality is
Yes.
is also very intrinsic to the pagan traditions, to the elemental aspects of this. To what degree does it manifest
Well, you
itself?
could call it sexuality. You could also call it a certain vibrant energy. I mean, it depends on into what channel you would put it. It could be put into any channel. But as I said, I think Elvis and I, we both shared an alien energy, maybe from another planet.
You know, you're also sort of you're married. You
Yes.
have a child. How does your husband? How do you relate to your husband?
Yes.
In a coming from a very sort of a tradition which looks very much as the empowered, emboldened, almost woman in her destructive, shall we say, garb.
Yes.
How does this lead to, domestic
Harmony?
bliss, harmony? How do you go about creating that?
Well, I might perhaps have one aspect of that in me, the woman in her destructive aspect. But I'm sure there is the other side to me also, the compassionate, the not so destructive. And as I said, what attracted me to my husband was that just as I felt there was the warrioress in me, there was the fighter in him also. Because it's not that he was the first man I'd met. I'd met other men, and somehow I'd found them a bit, what should I call them, a bit plasticky, a bit plastic all along. I wasn't really thinking of them in terms of marriage. But in my husband, I found a fighter. He'd had a very hard youth, a very hard childhood, and I think that was one of the things which attracted me to him. That he was not your conventional Romeo or your conventional Casanova. Here was a man who'd tasted the basics of the earth, the basics of struggle. And I thought we'd make a good team. And we'd fight well together. So maybe that's where the destructive attracted me to him also, and him to me.
You still haven't really, give us an example of the X factor operating in your life.
I've mentioned one incident which I found very, very thrilling and engrossing. That was when I was in the Grand Canyon on a field trip. And we raised the energy in Wicca parlance. And on that night, I saw a mist rising from the earth. We were on the floor of the Grand Canyon, and we saw a blue light rising from a crack in the earth, you could say, or from the earth itself. Now, later on, I asked many mystics about it. I asked many physicists about it. And they explained it in different ways. But that was an X factor. That was a natural phenomenon. And later on in my life, I have worked with natural phenomenon. I have raised a fog during a time during the 1998 election. I've done it myself. So that is an X factor. How does it happen? It happens. One can work with the elements. Apart from that, if you talk about the X factor, perhaps this is an area which still is under controversy. The other dimension, for example, life after death. I myself believe that the soul is not extinguished. The soul survives. And I had a very strange experience where a pet animal, a dog I was very attached to, I felt it and had proof of it in the astral. Things like this, there are so many things one could go on.
Is this sort of in your everyday life? And if you have sort of access and control of the elements, how are you able to use this? How often do you use it? Is it something that happens routinely and
No.
every reflex? Do you call upon it? Do you have to sort of energize yourself? Do you have to concentrate? Or is it just a natural reflex of who you are and what you are?
No. For example, now, if I were to do a chant for revenge, I would have to call upon an energy within myself. And I'm sure that without being destructive to an individual, I don't believe in being destructive to an individual physically, mentally.
But you believe in the notion of revenge.
But I believe in the notion of revenge, that justice must be had. Sometimes society will not give us justice. The legal system will not give us justice. But maybe I can give justice.
What does it achieve, justice?
What does it achieve? You mean, what does justice achieve? Justice for the sake of justice?
In the notion of revenge.
Yes.
And you feel that by exercising revenge,
yes,
there will be justice.
Right.
Does it solve your problem? Does it solve the predicament?
Yes.
Why waste your energy on revenge?
No, I think that revenge, I don't mean revenge for the sake of my personal satisfaction only.
But revenge, there is an element of that, is there?
Yes, of course, of course. If there has been wrong done, and if society has not looked at that person, if the legal system has ignored that, I feel that if my judgment tells me that yes, I can work something for that person.
Is your judgment fallible?
My judgment is fallible, I'm sure, but so far it has not been so.
Tell me that you still have many years to go in this life, in this body, in this incarnation. What goals, what agendas do you set yourself in the areas of statecraft and promoting your ideology, your philosophy, standing up for the exploited woman? What is your agenda, your goal, your dream, your aspiration?
Well, my agenda after this book, after I've published this book, is firstly that people should perhaps realize that there's a lot of strength in it, a lot of power in it. And the more I see of people and how they're accepting the book, I am satisfied that yes, they have recognized the power. That is a satisfaction.
Well, final quick question.
Yes.
How does the Wiccan tradition look at other traditions, techniques and practices?
I would say with an open mind. In the long run, we're all reaching for the same goal.
Thank you very much. That's been a great pleasure.
Thank you. Thank you.